The first sign that my marriage had been quietly dismantled did not come from an argument, a confession, or even a suspicious text message. It came from a voicemail left by a woman who assumed I already knew the truth. "Hi, this is Karen from Beacon Ridge Financial. I'm calling to confirm that you're aware the beneficiary changes requested by your husband were finalized this morning." She said it casually, like she was confirming a dentist appointment. "My name is Melissa Grant. I'm 31 years old, and at 9:23 on a Wednesday morning in early October, I learned that my husband had rewritten our future without bothering to tell me." I stood in the kitchen holding my phone long after the voicemail ended. The coffee machine hissed and clicked behind me, filling the silence with noise that felt suddenly intrusive. Outside, our quiet suburban street in Plano, Texas, looked exactly the same as it had every other morning. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical driveways, neighbors waving politely as they loaded kids into SUVs. Nothing looked broken. That was the most unsettling part. I played the voicemail again, then a third time. Beneficiary changes, plural. I had worked in risk assessment long enough to know what that usually meant. Retirement accounts, life insurance, investment portfolios, the financial skeleton of a marriage, the kind of things you didn't touch unless you were planning an exit or preparing for something irreversible. I checked the calendar. It wasn't our anniversary. It wasn't tax season. It wasn't after a fight. There had been no warning. I called my husband Evan immediately. It rang until voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I sat down at the dining table instead, the one we had picked together 2 years earlier, because he said it made the space feel grown up. I remembered laughing at that, teasing him for sounding like a realtor. At 10:15, Evan finally texted. "In a meeting, everything okay?" I stared at the screen. "Yes," I typed, then deleted it. "Call me," I wrote instead. He didn't respond. By noon, my hands were steady again. Years of professional conditioning kicked in, the same instinct that surfaced whenever a client insisted everything was fine, while documents quietly contradicted them. I logged into our shared financial portal. Or tried to. Access denied. I tried again, slower this time, as if patience might unlock something force had not. Same message. My chest tightened, not with panic but with recognition. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. I called Beacon Ridge Financial directly. I gave my name, my social security number, my date of birth. I answered security questions I hadn't thought about in years. My first car, my mother's maiden name. The representative's tone shifted halfway through the call. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grant," she said carefully. "Your access privileges were modified last week." "Modified how?" I asked. "Your husband is now listed as the sole account administrator." My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "When was this done?" She hesitated. "Thursday. Last Thursday." I had been at my sister's wedding out of town last Thursday. Evan hadn't come citing work deadlines. I remembered feeling disappointed but understanding. He always talked about responsibility like it was a virtue instead of a weapon. And the beneficiary changes, I asked. Another pause. "Your husband designated a family trust as primary beneficiary on multiple accounts." Family trust. Not me. I thanked her and ended the call before she could say anything else. The afternoon passed in a haze of mundane tasks that felt surreal. I folded laundry, I answered emails, I smiled politely during a video meeting while my mind cataloged details with brutal clarity. Family trust meant his parents, specifically his mother, Diane Grant. Diane had never liked me. She was polite, impeccably so, but her disapproval lived in subtleties. The way she corrected my phrasing, the way she insisted on handling holidays, the way she once said, smiling, "Evan has always been very generous with women who need stability." I had laughed at the time. I didn't laugh now. Evan came home at 6:45 later than usual. He kissed my cheek, loosened his tie, and asked what I wanted for dinner like nothing had changed. I waited until he finished washing his hands. "Did you change the beneficiaries on our accounts?" I asked. He froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. "Yes," he said finally, "I was going to tell you." When I asked, "Soon," he replied. "I didn't want to stress you out." I studied his face, the familiar one I had trusted, the one that now looked practiced. Why, I asked. He sighed as if burdened. My parents suggested it was safer. Temporarily. Safer for whom, I asked. "For us," he said quickly. "For the future." "Our future," I repeated, "without me listed anywhere." He rubbed his forehead. "It's just a formality. Nothing changes." Everything had changed. I looked at him and understood something with chilling certainty. This wasn't about money. This was about control. And whatever Evan thought he had secured by quietly cutting me out, he had underestimated one thing. I knew systems. I knew timing. And I knew exactly what happened when people mistook silence for ignorance. This wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a reckoning no one in his family had prepared for. I did not confront Evan again that night. Not because I was afraid of what he might say, but because I understood something essential. Once a person begins rewriting reality without you, your reaction becomes part of their calculation. Silence, when chosen, deliberately removes their advantage. I slept lightly, waking whenever Evan shifted beside me. His breathing stayed even, relaxed. He believed the hardest part was over. That belief would become expensive. At 6:45 the next morning, he left for work after a quick kiss and a reminder that we should talk later. The word later hovered in the doorway long after it closed. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before I moved. The first thing I did was open a notebook and write down everything I knew with certainty. Dates, names, accounts, conversations, assumptions were kept separate, facts stood alone. I learned early in my career that clarity begins by refusing to blur those two categories. At 8:15, I called an attorney. Not a divorce attorney, not yet. I called Rachel Mendel, a forensic financial consultant I had worked with years earlier on a corporate fraud case. She answered on the second ring. "Melissa Grant," she said. "This can't be a social call." "No," I replied, "it isn't." I explained the beneficiary changes, the access revocation, the family trust. I did not dramatize. I didn't need to. Rachel understood the weight of quiet moves. "Do you have documentation?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I will." "Then listen carefully," she replied. "Do nothing that tips them off. Don't change passwords. Don't threaten. Don't ask for access back. Observe." "That was my instinct," I said. "Good," she replied, "because this wasn't impulsive. It was coordinated." After we hung up, I logged into my personal email and searched Evan's name. I found nothing unusual. Then I searched his mother's name. That was when patterns began to surface. Calendar invitations forwarded months earlier. Messages framed as casual check-ins. Diane's language was always warm but directive, suggestive without appearing forceful. She never told Evan what to do. She simply presented ideas that framed my presence as risk. At 9:30, I drove to work. The office felt grounding, familiar rhythms, neutral territory. I completed tasks efficiently, even while part of my mind remained fixed on what I hadn't seen yet. At 11, Evan texted, "Can we have dinner with my parents tonight? They want to see you." I stared at the message. Perfect timing. "Yes," I replied. "That works." The speed of his response told me he hadn't expected agreement. "Great," he wrote. "Thank you." I spent my lunch break reviewing trust law in Texas, family trusts, beneficiary displacement, spousal consent requirements, exceptions, loopholes. There were several, but there were also vulnerabilities. At 3:20, Rachel emailed me a short list. Things to gather quietly. Account statements before last Thursday. Trust formation documents. Any emails referencing protection or temporary restructuring. Any third-party advisors involved. I already had half of that. At 5:40, Evan came home early, unusually cheerful. He asked if I was feeling okay. He commented on dinner smells. He didn't mention money. We drove to his parents' house in silence, broken only by radio news. Diane greeted us with an embrace that lingered just long enough to feel possessive. His father Robert nodded politely and returned to his chair. Dinner was immaculate, controlled. Conversation circled safely around neighbors' work travel plans. Then Diane smiled at me. "Melissa," she said, "Evan mentioned you seemed a bit stressed lately." I met her gaze evenly. "I've been busy." "Yes," she said. "Busy women sometimes overlook long-term security." Evan shifted uncomfortably. Diane continued, "We just want to make sure everything is structured properly, for the family." I nodded slowly. "Of course." Her smile tightened. "You know," she added, "marriages go through phases. It's wise to plan responsibly." I took a sip of water before replying. Planning without transparency tends to create instability. The table went quiet. Evan cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe." "It's fine," Diane said smoothly. "Melissa understands." I did. I understood that this dinner was not reconciliation. It was confirmation. When we left, Evan squeezed my hand in the car. "See," he said, "they just worry." "Yes," I replied, "I can tell." That night, while Evan slept, I opened my laptop and accessed the one system he hadn't thought to lock me out of. The professional one. Using my credentials, I pulled public filings tied to the Grant Family Trust. Formation date, trustees, amendments. The trust had been amended 3 times in the last 6 months. Each amendment reduced discretionary protections. Each one increased Evan's control. And each one assumed my silence. I leaned back and felt something settle into place. This wasn't betrayal in a moment of weakness. This was a strategy. And strategies once visible could be dismantled. I closed the laptop, gently turned off the light, and lay awake beside my husband, listening to him breathe. For the first time since the voicemail, I felt steady, because now I wasn't reacting. I was preparing, and preparation, I knew, was how systems survived storms. By Friday morning, I understood the shape of the plan, even if I didn't yet know all its contours. It was elegant in the way people convince themselves something unethical is simply prudent. Remove my access quietly. Reframe it as temporary protection. Anchor control inside a family trust I had no authority over. Wait for me to acclimate. If I objected, I would look emotional. If I stayed silent, I would become irrelevant. Diane had done this before. Not to me, but around me. I remembered how Evan's cousin had chosen to leave the family business after a restructuring that stripped her of decision-making power. How an aunt's inheritance had been delayed for years by administrative confusion that somehow always resolved in Diane's favor. At the time, I had filed those stories away as unfortunate. Now they read like case studies. I took the day off work, not to rest, to verify. I drove to the county clerk's office just after 9. The building smelled like paper and disinfectant, the kind of neutral scent designed to discourage lingering. I requested copies of the Grant Family Trust amendments, paid the fee, and waited while the clerk disappeared into the back. When she returned, she slid a thin stack across the counter. "These are public," she said. "Anything else is restricted." "This will do," I replied. I sat at a metal table near the window and read slowly. Dates aligned with what I had already seen online. Trustees listed as Evan and his father. Diane named as advisory authority. Language softened around spousal protections, redefined as contingent rather than assumed. It was clean, legal, and clearly designed by someone who knew exactly how far to push without crossing an obvious line. Back in the car, I called Rachel. "They anticipated you," she said after I summarized. "That means there's more you haven't seen yet." "Such as?" I asked. "Debt," she replied, "or exposure, or a trigger event." I thought of Evan's sudden urgency, Diane's talk of security, the timing of the changes while I was out of town. "What kind of trigger?" I asked. "Something that allows them to argue necessity," Rachel said. "Medical, financial, legal." I ended the call and drove home slowly. The house felt different now, not hostile, curated, as if certain rooms had been staged to support a story I hadn't been invited to read. Evan's office door was closed. I had never gone through his drawers. It hadn't seemed necessary before. I opened the door. His desk was tidy, almost aggressively so, laptop docked, papers stacked neatly. I scanned quickly, not touching anything that would leave a trace. In the bottom drawer, under old manuals and cables, I found a slim folder. Inside were loan documents, private, short-term, high interest. My pulse stayed steady. The loans were taken out over the last year, not catastrophic but significant, used to bridge cash flow gaps in a venture I hadn't known existed, a side investment, commercial real estate through a limited partnership. Diane's name appeared as guarantor. There it was. This wasn't about protecting Evan from me. It was about protecting the family from risk he had already taken. I photographed the documents with my phone and replaced everything exactly as I found it. When I closed the drawer, I felt a flicker of something like grief. Not because he had taken the loans, but because he had decided I was not someone to stand beside him while he did. Evan came home early again, flushed with energy. "Good news," he said. "Mom says we might be able to restructure some things soon." "That's great," I replied. He paused, searching my face. "You're taking this really well." "Yes," I said, "I am." That night, he suggested we open a bottle of wine. He talked about future plans, about buying something bigger, about how his parents were just trying to help. I listened without interruption. At 10:30, my phone buzzed. "Rachel, call me when you're alone." I stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. "I pulled some records," she said. "The partnership Evan's involved in is under quiet review, not an investigation yet. But lenders are nervous." "Because of leverage?" I asked. "And timing," she replied. "There's a refinancing deadline coming. If it's missed, guarantors get nervous." "Diane." "They moved the assets to shield exposure," I said. "Yes," Rachel confirmed, "and they assumed you wouldn't notice until it was irreversible." I leaned against the sink, the mirror reflecting a version of myself that looked calm, composed, intact. "What do you want to do?" Rachel asked. I thought carefully. "I want to let them finish," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then softly, "That's risky." "So is lying," I replied. When I returned to the bedroom, Evan was already asleep. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, mapping the next steps. Not in anger, in sequence. I would not confront him. I would not warn Diane. I would not block the restructuring. I would document. I would wait. I would choose the moment when truth required no amplification. The next move was theirs, and whatever they built on secrecy would have to bear its own weight. I closed my eyes, feeling something unfamiliar settle in. Not fear, certainty. The kind that comes when you stop trying to save people from the consequences they carefully arranged for themselves. The restructuring moved faster than I expected. By Monday morning, Evan was on the phone before 7, pacing the hallway with the low, urgent tone he used only when things were not under control. He didn't notice me watching from the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands as he repeated the same phrases over and over. Yes, I understand. No, she doesn't need to be involved. It's temporary. We just need the bridge. Temporary bridge. The language of people standing over a widening gap convinced the word itself can hold weight. When he ended the call, he looked almost relieved. Everything's moving, he said. We're stabilizing things. That's good, I replied. He studied my face again, searching for cracks. You trust me, right? I met his eyes. I trust patterns. He laughed uneasy. You always say strange things. They weren't strange. They were warnings. After he left for work, I sat at the dining table and opened my laptop. Rachel had sent me a secure folder overnight. Inside were summaries, timelines, and one note highlighted in yellow. Refinancing deadline 14 days. Failure triggers guarantor liability. Trust assets now primary shield. They had built a wall and placed me on the outside, believing that would protect what was inside. They hadn't considered that walls also trap the people who build them. At 10, Diane called. I answered on the third ring. Melissa, she said warmly, as if the last week had been nothing but a misunderstanding. I wanted to check in. Evan says you've been very understanding. I've been observant, I replied. A pause, barely perceptible. Well, she continued smoothly, these things can be unsettling if you don't have the full picture. I agree, I said. She smiled into the silence. Evan has always carried a lot of responsibility. It's part of who he is. So do I replied. Her voice cooled slightly. Of course, in different ways. There it was. I wanted to reassure you, she went on, that everything being done is for the family's protection. Which family, I asked. Another pause, longer this time. The Grant family, she said. I see, I replied. When the call ended, my hands were steady. That mattered. It meant I was thinking clearly. That afternoon, I received an automated email from Beacon Ridge Financial. Account update notification. The trust had been approved as temporary beneficiary pending final restructuring. Additional signatures required. Timeline expedited. Expedited. I forwarded the email to Rachel. They're rushing, she replied minutes later. That means pressure. At dinner, Evan barely ate. He pushed food around his plate, distracted his phone lighting up every few minutes with messages he pretended not to see. You're quiet, I said. Just tired, he replied. This will all settle soon. When I asked gently, after the refinance, he said automatically. Then he stopped. I raised an eyebrow. Refinance. He hesitated, then sighed. It's nothing, just business. I nodded. I thought everything was stable. It is, he said quickly. This is just finalizing. Finalizing. That night I lay awake long after Evan fell asleep, listening to the house settle around us. Every creak sounded louder than it should have. Every shadow felt sharper. I thought about the vows we had exchanged, about partnership, about transparency, about how easily those words were traded for convenience once power entered the room. On Wednesday, I took another day off. I met Rachel in person for the first time in years. Her office was small, neutral, designed to make emotions irrelevant. They're walking toward exposure, she said after reviewing the latest updates. The trust is now visibly tied to shielding liability. That's not illegal, but it's discoverable. By whom, I asked. Lenders, courts. And she paused you. I folded my hands. What happens if the refinance fails? The guarantors are on the hook, she said, and the trust becomes central evidence of intent. Intent. That was the word Diane feared most. On Thursday night, Evan came home late again. He didn't kiss me this time. He went straight to the shower as if washing could reset something. While he was gone, his phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The truth was already unfolding without my interference. On Friday morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope addressed to Evan. Legal documents, lender notices, deadline reminders. He read them standing in the doorway, face draining of color. Is everything okay? I asked. He swallowed. We're just running tight. Who is we? I asked. He didn't answer. That evening, Diane called again. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. You need to sign something, she said. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of something? A spousal acknowledgement, she replied. Just to confirm you're aware of the temporary restructuring. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Aware of what exactly? She inhaled sharply. Melissa, this isn't the time for semantics. It's always the time for semantics, I replied. That's where meaning lives. Her voice hardened. If you don't cooperate, you could destabilize everything. I answered calmly. Everything already is. The line went dead. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the house dim around me, and felt the weight of what was coming. They were about to learn something they had spent years avoiding. Silence is not the same as consent, and compliance is not loyalty. The countdown had started, and this time, I was not the one under pressure. The document Diane wanted me to sign arrived the next morning by courier, thick and deliberate, as if weight itself could imply legitimacy. It was titled Spousal Acknowledgement of Temporary Asset Reallocation, printed on expensive paper, bound neatly with colored tabs marking where my signature was expected. Temporary. Acknowledgement. Reallocation. Every word was chosen to soften what it actually meant. I waited until Evan left for work before opening it. The language was dense but careful. It did not ask for my consent. It asked me to confirm awareness. Awareness that certain marital assets were being placed under the authority of the Grant Family Trust. Awareness that these actions were taken in anticipation of potential market volatility. Awareness that I would not contest these changes in the future. Not now, in the future. I read the final page twice. A single sentence near the bottom tightened my chest. This acknowledgement constitutes evidence of informed spousal understanding in the event of subsequent dispute. Evidence. I closed the folder and slid it back into the envelope. At 10:30, Evan called. "Did something come for me?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. A pause, and "I'm reading it," I said. Another pause. "Okay. Mom just wants to make sure everything is clear." "It's very clear," I replied. He exhaled, relieved too quickly. "Good. We can talk tonight." We would, but not in the way he expected. I spent the rest of the morning assembling my own file. Screenshots, copies, photographs, public records, loan documents, trust amendments, emails framed as reassurance but structured as instruction. I didn't label anything emotionally. Everything was indexed by date and source. By noon, I had something more valuable than proof. I had narrative. At 1:15, Rachel called. "They're accelerating," she said. "That usually means the refinance isn't going smoothly." I assumed as much, I replied. "You should know," she continued, "if you sign that document, you effectively validate the intent behind the trust restructuring." "I won't," I said. "Good," she replied, "because if you don't, the absence of acknowledgement becomes meaningful." Meaningful how, I asked. "Because it forces them to explain why they moved assets without spousal consent," she said. "And explanation is where stories fall apart." That afternoon, Diane called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was clipped this time, irritation bleeding through control. "Melissa, this is becoming unnecessarily complicated. Evan is under enough pressure. We need your cooperation." Need, not request. I deleted the voicemail. Evan came home early that evening, his confidence visibly frayed. He didn't take off his shoes. He paced the living room, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them. "Did you look at the papers?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. And he pressed. I met his eyes. "I'm not signing." His face drained. "What? Why?" "Because they misrepresent what's happening," I said calmly. "They don't," he insisted. "It's just formalizing things." "They formalize the removal of my legal standing," I replied. "That's not temporary. That's strategic." "You're overthinking this," he snapped. "No," I said. "I'm reading it." He ran a hand through his hair. "My parents are trying to help us." "They're trying to shield themselves," I corrected, "from your decisions." He flinched. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I said. His voice rose. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." I stood. "You don't understand the position you put me in." Silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. "If you don't sign," he said quietly, "this could blow up." I nodded. "Yes, and you're okay with that?" he asked. "I'm okay with the truth," I replied. He stared at me like I was someone he had never met. That night, he slept on the couch. The next morning, the calls started. Diane. Robert. An unfamiliar number I suspected was their attorney. I answered none of them. At 11, Rachel emailed me. "Refinance delayed. Lender requesting additional disclosures." I smiled faintly. Delay was not failure. Delay was scrutiny. At 2, Evan texted. "Please, we need to talk." We already had, I thought. Instead of replying, I drove to the bank. Not Beacon Ridge. A different one. I opened a new account in my name only. I transferred my personal savings. I updated my direct deposit. I did not hide it. I did not announce it. I simply acted. Autonomy does not require permission. That evening, Evan came home subdued. "They're saying the lender wants more transparency," he said. "They're asking about the trust." "That makes sense," I replied. "They might need you to sign something else," he added carefully. "I won't," I said. He sank into a chair. "Why are you doing this?" I answered honestly. "Because you made decisions that excluded me, and now you want my compliance to legitimize them." "That's not how I see it," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's the problem." Late that night, as I lay awake alone in the bedroom, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "You should prepare. This is heading toward a legal inflection point." I typed back a single word. "Good." Because for the first time since the voicemail, I understood the truth clearly. They didn't fear my anger. They didn't fear confrontation. They feared my refusal to participate. And that refusal was about to force everything into the open. The next chapter would not be quiet, but it would be honest. The legal inflection point arrived on a Tuesday morning disguised as an invitation. It was an email from a law firm I had never contacted, sent with polished neutrality and just enough warmth to appear reasonable. Subject: request for discussion regarding Grant Family Trust matters. They wanted to schedule a call. They framed it as clarification. They CC'd Evan. That detail mattered. I read the email twice, then once more without emotion. This was no longer a family disagreement. This was counsel stepping in to formalize pressure. I forwarded it to Rachel without comment. Her reply came less than 5 minutes later. "Do not call them. Respond in writing only, and copy me." I replied accordingly. "I am available to receive questions in writing. Please direct all correspondence to my counsel." I did not name Rachel. I didn't need to. The sentence itself shifted the balance. Evan called immediately. "What did you do?" he asked. "I set boundaries," I replied. "You made it worse," he said, voice tight. "No," I said calmly, "I made it visible." There was a long pause. "They're saying the lender is nervous," he admitted. "They want assurances." "Assurances of what?" I asked. "That everything is clean," he said. "And is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. That afternoon, the second shoe dropped. The lender formally requested disclosure of all spousal acknowledgments related to the trust restructuring. Not suggested. Requested. With a deadline. Rachel called me as soon as she saw the notice. "This is the moment," she said. "If they submit documents without your signature, it raises questions. If they submit yours, it implicates you." "I won't sign," I said. "I know," she replied, "but you need to understand what comes next." "Tell me," I said. "If the refinance collapses," she continued, "liability shifts. The trust becomes evidence of intent to shield assets, and intent invites scrutiny." Scrutiny was the word Diane feared more than failure. That evening, Diane came to the house unannounced. She didn't knock. She rang the bell twice sharply, like urgency could substitute for permission. Evan opened the door before I could move. Her expression was controlled, but strained, the kind of composure built from decades of practice. "We need to talk," she said. All three of us sat in the living room, arranged instinctively into a triangle of tension. Diane spoke first. "This situation has escalated unnecessarily," she said, looking directly at me. "We are trying to protect the family." "You're trying to protect yourselves," I replied. Her jaw tightened. "That's an uncharitable interpretation." "It's accurate," I said. Evan shifted. "Melissa, please, this is serious." "Yes," I replied, "it is." Diane leaned forward. "If the lender pulls out, the losses will be significant." "For whom?" I asked. She hesitated. "For Evan, for Robert, for the trust." "And for me?" I asked. She smiled thinly. "You're not exposed." "That's the problem," I said. "You removed me so you could say that." Her eyes flashed. "You're being emotional." "No," I said. "I'm being precise." Evan stood abruptly. "Enough. This isn't helping." Diane turned to him. "Tell her what happens if she doesn't cooperate." He swallowed. "The refinance could fail." "And then?" I asked. He looked away. "Then the guarantors are liable." "And who are the guarantors?" I asked. "Silence," Diane answered. "Your husband, his father." "And the trust?" I pressed. She exhaled sharply. "The trust is involved." "There it is," I said. Her voice hardened. "Melissa, if this collapses, it will affect your marriage." I met her gaze evenly. "That damage was done when you decided I was expendable." Evan looked between us, panic creeping into his voice. "We can fix this. Just sign the acknowledgement. We'll undo it later." "Undoing illegal intent doesn't work retroactively," I replied. Diane stood. "You're choosing to burn everything down." I shook my head. "I'm choosing not to lie to keep it standing." She left without another word. Evan sank back into the chair, face in his hands. "I never wanted this," he said. I softened slightly. "I believe you." "Then why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because you let them make decisions that erased me," I said quietly. "And now you want me to legitimize them." He didn't respond. The next day, the lender issued a conditional notice. Refinance approval pending satisfactory disclosure. Failure to comply may result in withdrawal. Diane called again. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove to Rachel's office. We sat across from each other, the air heavy with inevitability. "They're running out of time," she said. "If they submit without you, it raises red flags. If they wait, they miss the window. And if they force it, I asked. They can't, she replied, not without exposing intent. I nodded. Then we wait. That evening, Evan packed a bag. I need space, he said. That's fair, I replied. He hesitated at the door. If this ends badly? It already did, I said gently. We're just acknowledging it now. When the door closed, the house felt larger, quieter, honest. At 9:30, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, I answered. Melissa, a man's voice, said, This is Thomas Keller, counsel for the Grant Family Trust. Yes, I replied. We'd like to resolve this cooperatively, he said. Then put everything in writing, I replied, and include full disclosures. A pause. That may complicate matters, he said. Truth usually does, I replied. The call ended. I stood in the kitchen alone, lights low, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The stillness no longer frightened me. They had reached the point where silence no longer protected them, and I had reached the point where speaking was no longer necessary. The system was awake now, and it would not go back to sleep. By Thursday morning, the pressure had become visible even to people who were not looking for it. Evan's absence changed the house, not emotionally, but practically. Fewer lights on, less noise, a stillness that felt intentional instead of empty. I noticed how easily I moved through the rooms without adjusting myself to someone else's schedule. That more than anything confirmed how long I had been compressing my life to fit his. At 9:10, Rachel called. They missed the first internal deadline, she said. That's not public yet, but it will be. How long do they have, I asked. 48 hours, she replied. After that, the lender has to decide whether to withdraw or escalate. Escalate meant subpoenas, document demands, questions no one could smooth over with tone or relationships. At 11, Thomas Keller emailed again. Subject proposed resolution framework. Attached was a 3-page document that read like compromise and functioned like surrender. It asked me to acknowledge awareness of the restructuring without explicitly endorsing it in exchange for assurances that my long-term interests would be protected after refinancing. After. Always after. I forwarded it to Rachel. Her response was immediate. They're offering future promises to cover past actions. That's an admission of exposure. Good. I drafted a reply that afternoon. I am unable to acknowledge awareness of actions taken without my consent. Any representation suggesting otherwise would be inaccurate. Please proceed accordingly. I copied Rachel. I did not copy Evan. The reply came 2 hours later, shorter this time. We will advise our clients. Translation, they had no leverage left. That evening, Diane called from a number I hadn't saved. I answered. You've made your point, she said without greeting. I haven't made any point, I replied. I've stated facts. Her voice tightened. The lender is considering withdrawal. That's their decision, I said. If they pull out, she continued, the losses will be substantial. For whom I asked. She didn't answer. You think you're immune, she said instead. I think I'm accurate, I replied. You're destroying your marriage, she snapped. I took a breath. My marriage was altered without my consent. I'm just no longer pretending it wasn't. Silence. Then unexpectedly her voice softened. You could have been part of this, I said, until you replaced me. Her breath caught just slightly. That wasn't my intention, she said. It was your outcome, I replied. She hung up. Friday arrived with no resolution. At 10:47, Rachel texted me a single sentence. Lender escalated. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no panic, only confirmation. At noon, Evan showed up at the house. He looked exhausted. His confidence, once so practiced, had thinned into something brittle. They're asking for full disclosure, he said. Everything. Emails, drafts, trust amendments. Yes, I replied. They want to know why the trust was amended so many times, he continued. That's a reasonable question, I said. They're asking why you weren't informed, he added. I met his eyes. And what are you telling them? He hesitated, that it was complicated. It wasn't, I said gently. It was deliberate. He sank into the chair opposite me. I didn't think it would get this far. I know, I replied. You thought silence would hold. He looked at me, then really looked at me like he was seeing the cost for the first time. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I believe that, I replied. But intention doesn't cancel strategy. His voice cracked. What happens now? I considered the question carefully. Now I said the truth stops being optional. That afternoon, the lender issued a formal notice of conditional withdrawal pending review by their risk committee. The language was precise, unemotional, final. At 5, Diane arrived again. She didn't argue this time. She sat across from me, shoulders rigid, eyes sharp but tired. They want documentation we can't sanitize, she said. Yes, I replied. They're talking about intent, she added. Yes, I said again. She looked at me, searching. If you speak for us. I won't, I said calmly. If you say you knew. I didn't, I replied. If you just help us get through this, I interrupted gently. You don't want help, you want cover. Her jaw tightened. You're choosing this. No, I said. I'm refusing to choose dishonesty. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she asked the question she had avoided since the beginning. What do you want? The question surprised her when it landed. I want my name removed from anything I didn't authorize, I said. I want no future claims made on my silence or compliance, and I want the truth documented. That could ruin us, she whispered. It might, I replied, but it will also end this. She closed her eyes briefly. At 8:30, Rachel called again. They're withdrawing, she said. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight settle. What does that mean? I asked. The refinance is dead, she replied, and the trust is now visible as a shield attempt. Exposure. Diane stood abruptly. You did this. I shook my head. You built it. She left without another word. Evan didn't follow her. He stayed seated, staring at the floor. I don't know how to fix this, he said. You can't, I replied softly, but you can stop making it worse. He nodded slowly, the fight finally gone. That night I slept alone in the bedroom, the house quiet and still. The collapse had happened. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. And for the first time since the voicemail that started everything, I understood something clearly. This was no longer about money or control or family power. It was about truth becoming heavier than the lies built to contain it. And once that balance shifted, nothing could hold it back. The morning after the refinance collapsed, the world felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight came through the kitchen window at the same angle it always had. The neighbor's dog barked. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. Nothing in the physical world acknowledged that an entire financial structure had just failed under its own weight. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing at the counter, grounding myself in the small, undeniable facts of the moment. My hands were steady. My breathing was normal. That was how I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. At 9:03, my phone rang. Rachel. The lender formally withdrew overnight, she said. Risk committee vote was unanimous. I closed my eyes. What happens now? Now the guarantors are exposed, she replied, and the trust amendments will be scrutinized for intent. Intent again. That word kept resurfacing because it was the one thing no one could erase. Evan's parents will likely face civil action, she continued, and possibly regulatory review, depending on what else turns up. And Evan, I asked. Rachel paused. That depends on what he signed and what he knew. I thanked her and ended the call. Evan was still asleep on the couch when I left for work. I didn't wake him. There was nothing left to say before the consequences finished unfolding. Words at this stage only muddied the record. At the office, I moved through my day on muscle memory. Meetings, reports, conversations that felt faintly unreal, like I was observing myself from a distance. Only once did someone ask if I was okay. Yes, I said and meant it. At lunch, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. This is Robert Grant. Please call me. I stared at the screen, then set the phone face down. At 1:15, the message came again. We need to talk. This has gone too far. Too far. I didn't respond. At 3:40, Diane emailed me directly for the first time since the lender withdrew. Subject: this did not have to happen. The body of the email was longer than I expected. Defensive, emotional, careful not to admit wrongdoing while laying blame everywhere else. She wrote about family loyalty, about misunderstanding my intentions, about how she had always seen me as part of their future. She ended with one line that clarified everything. You could still help us mitigate the damage. I closed the email without replying. When I arrived home, Evan was sitting at the dining table, the same table where I had first listened to the voicemail that changed everything. Papers were spread out in front of him, legal notices, lender correspondence, copies of trust documents I recognized immediately. They're coming after my parents, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. They're saying the trust was used to shield exposure, he continued. Yes, I said again. He looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed. Were you always going to let this happen? I considered the question carefully. I was always going to stop lying, I said. What happened after that was out of my hands. He nodded slowly, as if that answer finally made sense. They want statements, he said, from all of us. I've already given mine, I replied. He swallowed. What did you say? The truth, I said, that I wasn't informed, that I didn't consent, that I didn't participate. Silence fell between us. And us, he asked finally. The question hung heavy in the air. I can't stay married to someone who let other people erase me, I said softly, especially when it was convenient. His shoulders slumped. I didn't think it would come to this. I know, I replied. You thought I'd adapt. He didn't argue. That night, he packed the rest of his things. Not angrily, not dramatically, just carefully, like someone dismantling a life piece by piece because there was no other option left. When he left the house, felt quiet but not empty. It felt honest. The next week passed in a blur of official notices and procedural steps. Evan's parents retained separate counsel. Depositions were scheduled. Requests for documents multiplied. The trust amendments were flagged. Diane's careful language was dissected line by line by people who did not care about her intentions, only her actions. One afternoon I received a subpoena, not as a target, as a witness. Rachel reviewed it with me over coffee. "This is clean," she said. "They're not after you." "I know," I replied. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she added. I shook my head. I did what I was no longer willing not to do. The deposition took place 2 weeks later. A sterile room, neutral faces, questions designed to pin facts in place so they could never be rearranged again. When it was over, the attorney on the other side closed his folder and looked at me carefully. "You stepped away at the right time," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Most people don't," he added. I thought of Diane, of Evan, of how many times I had almost signed something just to keep the peace. "I know," I said. That evening, I went home, opened all the windows, and let fresh air move through the house. I boxed up the last shared items and set them by the door for Evan to collect later. I didn't cry. Grief would come, I knew, but not yet. What I felt instead was something quieter and more durable. Ownership. Of my name, of my choices, of the truth. The collapse everyone feared had already happened. What remained was rebuilding. And this time, it would be built without lies. Rebuilding does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity or relief. It begins with logistics. On Monday morning, I met with my attorney and filed the initial separation paperwork. Not because anyone had demanded it, but because ambiguity had already cost me enough. The filing was clean, unemotional, framed around irreconcilable differences and financial disentanglement. No accusations, no narratives, just facts. Evan didn't contest it. That too told me everything. By midweek, my name was officially removed from any reference tied to the Grant Family Trust. Not ceremonially, administratively, a series of filings, amendments, and confirmations that quietly severed me from a structure that had never been built to include me honestly. Diane did not call. Robert sent one brief email through counsel acknowledging receipt of documents and requesting no further direct contact. I agreed without hesitation. Distance once earned should be respected. At work, my manager asked if I needed time off. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. Not because nothing hurt, but because nothing was unclear anymore. Clarity has a stabilizing effect that grief does not immediately disrupt. The depositions continued without me. Evan's parents were questioned separately. Advisors distanced themselves. Lenders reviewed exposure. The story that had once been framed as prudent family protection began to unravel under consistent questioning. Why was the trust amended so frequently? Why was the spouse excluded? Why were disclosures incomplete? There were no good answers. I heard fragments through Rachel, not gossip. Outcomes. Diane's advisory roles were suspended pending review. The family's access to certain investment vehicles was restricted. Civil action was being considered by at least one partner. Power, I learned, doesn't vanish loudly. It recedes when no one is willing to vouch for it anymore. One evening, Evan came by to collect the last of his things. We stood in the hallway, careful not to stand too close. "I didn't protect you," he said quietly. "No," I replied, "you didn't." He nodded, accepting it. "I thought keeping the peace meant keeping control." "I know," I said. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want now?" The question felt strange in my mouth, like a language I was only just learning. "I want a life that doesn't require permission," I said. He didn't argue. After he left, I sat on the floor and let myself feel the weight of everything I had been holding. Not dramatically, just fully. Loss doesn't need spectacle to be real. Weeks passed. The legal process moved at its own pace. I downsized the house. I sold what I didn't need. I changed routines that no longer made sense. I stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't asked. One afternoon, Rachel called with an update. "They're settling," she said, quietly. "With whom?" I asked. "Several parties," she replied. "Your testimony narrowed their options." I closed my eyes, not in satisfaction, in closure. Later that evening, I walked through my neighborhood as the sun dipped low houses glowing softly from within. I thought about how easily I had once mistaken proximity for safety, how often I had equated silence with stability. I understood now that real security isn't built through control. It's built through consent. The system had not protected me. The marriage had not protected me. I had protected myself by stepping back. When I returned home, I sat at my desk and opened a new document. No case notes, no timelines. A list. What I will no longer accept, what I will no longer sign, what I will no longer excuse. The list was short. It didn't need to be long. That night, as I turned off the lights, I realized something important. The reckoning I had feared was not what destroyed my life. It was what returned it to me. And whatever came next would not be built in reaction. It would be built by choice. The first time I noticed peace, it felt unfamiliar enough to be suspicious. It happened on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Evan moved out. I woke naturally without an alarm, without the dull tension that used to settle in my chest before my eyes even opened. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not abandoned. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, landing softly on the floor. Nothing demanded my attention. I lay there for several minutes listening. No footsteps, no phone buzzing with urgency, no sense that something was about to go wrong. That was when I understood how long I had been living on alert. I made breakfast slowly, eggs, toast, coffee. I ate at the table instead of standing at the counter. Small choices, but each one felt like a reclamation. I was no longer optimizing my movements to avoid conflict or inconvenience. I was simply existing. Later that morning, Rachel called. "They finalized the first settlement," she said. "With whom?" I asked. "One of the lenders," she replied. "Non-disclosure, but the terms are humbling." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "And Diane?" I asked. Rachel paused. "She's not handling it well." I felt no rush of emotion, just acknowledgement. "That's not my responsibility," I said. "No," Rachel agreed. "It isn't." After we hung up, I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up. People walked dogs. Someone watered their lawn. Life moved forward without asking permission from the past. That afternoon, I received a message from an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "I heard you handled a difficult situation with a lot of integrity. If you're ever interested in consulting, let me know." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Consulting meant autonomy. It meant choosing projects instead of inheriting them. It meant clarity about where my responsibility began and ended. I replied simply, "I'd like that." The shift in my life didn't come from a dramatic decision. It came from a series of small, deliberate ones. I changed my routines. I moved my workspace into a room that had once been Evan's office. I donated clothes I had worn to fit an image that was no longer required. One evening, while sorting through old files, I found a printed copy of the spousal acknowledgement Diane had wanted me to sign. The pages were creased at the corners, the ink slightly smudged from where my fingers had lingered. I shredded it slowly, listening to the sound of paper tearing into certainty. The following week, Evan's parents' names appeared in a business journal article. Not prominently, not flattering, just referenced as part of a broader piece on trust misuse and lender oversight. No one called me about it. That was its own kind of justice. Evan texted once late at night. "I didn't know how to stand up to them. I'm sorry." I read the message without anger. "I'm not angry," I replied, "but I won't live that way again." He didn't respond, and I didn't wait. As autumn settled in, my life grew fuller in ways I hadn't anticipated. I took on a short consulting contract. I met new people who asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers. I started sleeping through the night. One afternoon, while reviewing a new client's documents, I noticed a familiar pattern. Assets moved quietly, disclosures delayed, language softened. I flagged it immediately. "This needs to be corrected," I said calmly, "before it becomes something else." The room went silent. Then someone nodded. "You're right." It struck me then how powerful clarity becomes when you're no longer afraid of losing your place. That evening, I went for a long walk as the sky deepened into blue and gray. Leaves crunched under my shoes. The air smelled like change. I thought about how close I had come to signing away my voice for comfort. How easily my future could have been folded into someone else's strategy. I hadn't escaped because I was smarter. I had escaped because I stopped cooperating with erasure. When I returned home, I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the quiet space that was now fully mine. No one was waiting for an explanation. No one expected me to fix anything. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden, and that I realized was the foundation I had been missing all along. The past has a way of returning when you least expect it, not to reclaim space, but to test whether you've truly changed. For me, that test arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, carried in a thin envelope with unfamiliar handwriting. It was from Diane. Not through counsel, not formal, not defensive, just a letter. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and went about my evening as if it weren't there. I cooked dinner. I answered emails. I watered the plant by the window. I wanted to know whether the sight of her name still controlled my nervous system. It didn't. When I finally opened the envelope, the letter was shorter than I expected. No accusations, no justifications, no demands. She wrote about silence, about how loud it had become once there was no one left to manage outcomes for her. She admitted that she had always believed control was care, that structure was love, that people who resisted her plans were simply too emotional to understand the bigger picture. She wrote one sentence twice, crossing it out the first time and rewriting it more clearly. "I thought you would adapt." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. That sentence explained everything. Adapt meant comply quietly. Adapt meant absorb risk. Adapt meant disappear when inconvenient. The woman I was before might have written back, carefully, politely, trying to clarify feelings, soften edges, preserve dignity for both of us. The woman I was now did something else. Nothing. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. At work, my consulting calendar began to fill faster than I anticipated. Word traveled quietly in professional circles. People didn't describe me as aggressive or brilliant or relentless. They used a different word. Clear. Clear about boundaries, clear about risk, clear about when something was not acceptable. That clarity created trust faster than any performance ever had. One afternoon during a strategy session with a new client, a senior partner tried to push through a decision without documentation. "We'll fix it later," he said casually. I closed my notebook. Later is when things become unfixable. The room went quiet. Then the partner nodded. "She's right." It struck me how different that moment would have felt a year ago. I would have softened my tone, hedged my language, worried about being perceived as difficult. Now, I simply stated the truth and allowed others to decide what to do with it. Power shifts when fear exits the room. That weekend, Evan reached out again. Not with guilt, not with excuses, with honesty. "I'm moving closer to my parents. They need help navigating what's coming." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "I hope you find peace," I wrote. "I won't be part of that system again." He responded quickly. "I understand." For the first time, I believed him. The legal matters continued in the background, no longer orbiting my life, but intersecting it only when necessary. Depositions concluded, settlements finalized, oversight structures imposed. The Grant family name slowly disappeared from investment spaces it had once dominated, not with scandal, with restriction. Restriction is what happens when trust runs out. One evening while reviewing documents for a client, I found myself smiling at a footnote most people would never read. A safeguard had been added, a requirement strengthened, a loophole quietly closed. I hadn't written it, but someone like me had, and that mattered. I began mentoring a junior consultant named Leah. She reminded me of myself years earlier, sharp, careful, over-responsible. She asked me one afternoon how I learned to speak up so confidently. "I stopped believing I was responsible for everyone's comfort," I said. She blinked. "You're allowed to do that." "Yes," I replied. "And so are you." She smiled like someone who had just been handed a map. That night, I went home and reorganized the last remaining boxes from my marriage. I found photos, mementos, things that once symbolized security but now felt like artifacts from a different life. I didn't throw them away. I didn't linger over them either. I chose what to keep. Choice, I learned, was the opposite of adaptation. Later, lying in bed, I thought about the version of myself who had listened to that voicemail months ago, standing in the kitchen, heart racing, wondering how much damage she could prevent if she just stayed calm. That woman believed survival meant flexibility. This woman knew survival meant integrity. The difference was not dramatic, it was deliberate. I turned off the light and let the quiet settle, not as absence, but as space. The reckoning had passed. The rebuilding was underway. And for the first time, I trusted the structure of my life, not because someone else approved it, but because it was built on truth. There was only one chapter left, not of collapse, but of arrival. Arrival does not feel like victory, it feels like steadiness. I realized I had arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning while standing in line at a coffee shop near my apartment. The barista asked for my name, and when I said it, I didn't brace myself. I didn't wonder who else carried it, who might misuse it, or what it obligated me to fix. It was just mine. That was new. My life no longer moved in reaction to anyone else's expectations. My calendar was full, but intentionally so. Consulting work that respected my boundaries. Clients who listened when I said no. Evenings that ended quietly instead of in analysis and rehearsal for conversations that never went anywhere. The legal aftermath of the Grant family situation concluded without ceremony. Final settlements were signed, oversight measures implemented. Diane's name appeared one last time in a regulatory summary, then disappeared completely. Evan's role diminished into something small and careful, far from the confidence he once borrowed from his parents' power. None of it required my attention anymore. One afternoon, Rachel called just to check in. You know, she said most people would have handled that by exploding or collapsing. I almost did neither, I replied. She laughed softly. You did something harder. You disengaged. Yes, I said, and I stayed honest. That night, I walked through my apartment noticing details I had overlooked before. The way the light hit the wall in the evening, the quiet satisfaction of a space arranged entirely to my taste. Nothing here was optimized for negotiation. Nothing was provisional. I thought about Diane's letter, about the sentence she rewrote. I thought you would adapt. She was right about one thing. I did adapt. I adapted out of silence, out of erasure, out of systems that required my compliance to function but never my consent. I adapted into someone who understood that love without respect is control and security without transparency is a trap. A week later, Leah invited me to speak at a small professional roundtable. Nothing formal, just a conversation about ethics, boundaries, and decision-making under pressure. When someone asked how to protect themselves in complex systems, I answered without hesitation. Document everything, refuse ambiguity, and never confuse being useful with being valued. Heads nodded around the room. Driving home afterward, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for what I had endured, but for what it had stripped away. Illusions, obligations that weren't real, roles I had mistaken for love. When I reached my apartment, I stood at the door for a moment before going inside. This was my life now. No one was waiting to see if I would adapt. No one was rewriting my future behind my back. No one needed me to disappear for their plans to work. If you are listening to this story and recognizing yourself in it, hear this clearly. You do not owe silence to people who make decisions without you. You are not selfish for refusing to legitimize your own exclusion. And walking away is not failure when staying requires erasure. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not exposure. It is not punishment. It is not watching someone fall. It is building a life so solid that their control can no longer reach you. I didn't take anything from them. I took myself back. And once you do that, everything else finally makes sense.